1917. The world is starving. The Great War has stripped the fields of men, and the horse is officially obsolete. But in Moline, Illinois, the king of the plow was walking into a death trap. While Henry Ford flooded the American fields with cheap horsepower, John Deere sat paralyzed, too proud to adapt and too slow to fight back. We call this the Pincer Movement. Squeezed between a technological dead end and a competitor selling at a loss, the company had to make a final, impossible choice. To survive, they would have to betray their reputation for perfection and bet everything on a loud, vibrating insult to mechanics, or vanish. The trouble started in Europe in 1914. World War I wasn't just a conflict of munitions, it was a war of logistics. As the front line stabilized, the global food supply chain buckled. The primary engine of agriculture for millennia, the horse, was suddenly removed from the equation. British and French armies, working through American agents, purchased millions of draft animals to haul artillery and supplies. By 1917, relying on the remaining livestock became an economic impossibility. A single horse required 5 acres of crops annually just to sustain itself. With corn prices spiking 156% since the start of the hostilities, biological power was no longer viable. Simultaneously, the labor force evaporated. Young men left for the front, leaving fields unworked. The global demand for wheat skyrocketed, and the only solution was a machine that didn't consume expensive grain or require rest. The tractor ceased to be a novelty for the wealthy. It became a tool of survival. In Moline, Illinois, John Deere remained the undisputed leader in tillage. They were masters of metallurgy, forging blades that could scour clean, even in sticky prairie soil. They had an extensive dealer network and a reputation for durability. However, they possessed a fatal technical gap. They were blacksmiths in the age of mechanics. They understood leverage in steel, but they had almost no internal capacity for internal combustion engineering. At the helm, William Butterworth viewed the emerging tractor market with skepticism. The son-in-law of Charles Deere, Butterworth was a fiscal conservative who prioritized liquidity over innovation. Between 1910 and 1912, Deere had completed a massive acquisition spree, buying 10 companies to build a full line of implements. Their capital was tied up in new factories, leaving no liquidity for R&D experiments. In September 1916, Butterworth issued a blunt directive regarding mass production. "I am opposed to any discussion on Deere manufacturing tractors." While he allowed a small experimental run of Joseph Dane's all-wheel drive tractor, he refused to commit the capital necessary for a full-scale rollout. He effectively stalled the company's entry into the mass market just as it began to close in. By 1917, the industry landscape shifted into a pincer movement, and Deere stood directly in the center. On the high end sat the heavyweights, International Harvester. They were the General Motors of the field. Their Titan 1020 and Mogul 816 were the standards of the day, but they were dinosaurs. The Titan was a massive 5,700-pound machine, powered by a slow-turning 2-cylinder engine that hammered away at just 500 RPM. These were essentially stationary engines on wheels, reliable, but heavy, expensive, and clumsy in small fields. If Deere attempted to build a heavy tractor to compete here, they would be outspent and out-engineered. The threat from the low end, however, was far more dangerous. Henry Ford turned his production capacity toward agriculture, introducing the Fordson Model F, and it completely rewrote the rulebook. Ford didn't just build a cheaper tractor, he built a fundamentally different machine. The Model F ditched the heavy rail frame entirely for a revolutionary unit construction design, where the engine, transmission, and rear axle housing were bolted together to form the chassis. It weighed only 2,700 pounds, less than half the weight of an IH Titan. Yet its 4-cylinder, 251 cubic inch engine still delivered 20 belt horsepower at a screaming 1,000 RPM. Then came the price. Ford dropped the Model F at $750. This was predatory pricing. A Waterloo Boy Model N cost over $1,000. An IH Mogul was nearly as much for half the agility. Ford was willing to accept razor-thin margins to capture market share, relying on unprecedented volume to generate profit. While competitors needed hundreds of dollars in profit per unit to survive, Ford could thrive on a fraction of that. He produced tractors on assembly lines at a speed traditional implement manufacturers could not comprehend, let alone match. Butterworth's hesitation had trapped the company in a deadly position. Deere was too small to fight the capital dominance of International Harvester, and their production methods were too expensive to combat the engineering and pricing of Henry Ford. This was an existential crisis. Farmers weren't just buying tractors, they were abandoning horse-drawn plows. Every bright gray Fordson delivered to the farm was a Deere plow that went unsold. The tractor was no longer the future, it was the current standard. John Deere, the most iconic name in American agriculture, was on the brink of obsolescence. They needed a machine. They needed it immediately, and the paralysis in the boardroom had to break. When the reality of the Fordson hit the boardroom in Moline, the atmosphere shifted instantly from hesitation to emergency execution. Deere wasn't just behind the curve, they were invisible in a market that was exploding. Management stopped debating whether tractors were a fad and started authorizing capital for anything with an engine. What followed was a period of frantic experimentation that produced some of the most mechanically confused machines in the company's history. You have to understand the level of desperation here. Deere didn't just try to build a tractor, they scrambled to invent one from scratch without a blueprint. The result was the Melvin, a mechanical dead end that looked less like a tractor and more like an engineering accident. The Melvin defied the logic of Midwestern farming. It was a motor plow, where the engine and the plows were fused into a single rigid frame. While the concept seemed efficient on paper, it was a nightmare in the dirt. It was heavy, underpowered, and nearly impossible to maneuver. A farmer needs to pivot tight at the headland to line up the next furrow, but the Melvin handled like a locomotive. It became a sunk cost, a clumsy beast that was quickly scrapped, leaving the company embarrassed and empty-handed. Internalizing the lesson that outside partnerships were risky, the board turned inward to their own head of engineering, Joseph Dane. Dane was a purist, a visionary who believed John Deere should never badge a product that wasn't mechanically superior. He locked himself away and designed a machine that was arguably decades ahead of its time. The all-wheel drive train was a masterpiece. Unlike the crude iron lungs roaming the fields of 1917, the Dane was sophisticated. It utilized a 4-cylinder engine and a complex transmission without a single exposed chain or gear. It ran smooth, quiet, and, thanks to the all-wheel drive system, it had superior tractive efficiency. It was the Cadillac of tractors in a world of ox carts. The R&D department looked at the Dane and saw the future, a machine that finally bridged the gap between the blacksmith and the engineer. However, the board of directors looked at the Dane and saw a bankruptcy filing. The problem wasn't the engineering, it was the unit cost. To build the Dane with its precision-cut gears and high-tensile steel cost a fortune. Internal estimates pegged the retail price between $1,200 and $1,600 just to break even. This hit the table at the exact moment Henry Ford was flooding the market with the Model F for $750. The math was brutal. You cannot sell a luxury tractor to a farmer struggling to buy seed. The Dane was too good, too expensive, and too late. Tragically, Joseph Dane never saw the final decision. In October 1917, while pushing himself to the limit field testing the machine in the cold damp of fall, he contracted pneumonia and died. The project died with him. Butterworth shelved the plans. They had built the perfect tractor, but they had to abandon it because it couldn't survive in a Ford world. The company was left in a darker place than where they started. They had wasted years and capital on the Melvin disaster. They had sacrificed their best talent on the Dane tragedy. Now as 1918 approached, the king of the plow had no tractor, no engine, and no plan. They had tried the path of acquisition, and they had tried the path of perfection. Both had failed. With their engineering pride stripped away, the directors realized they had run out of time for invention. They could no longer afford to be idealistic. If they wanted to survive the year, they would have to stop looking for a beautiful solution and start looking for a profitable one. The answer wasn't in Moline, it was waiting in Iowa, in the form of a loud, vibrating, kerosene-burning machine that their own engineers considered an insult to the mechanic's trade. The solution didn't come from a drawing board in Moline. It came from a pragmatic factory in Iowa. Enter the Waterloo Boy. If the canceled Dane project was a thoroughbred, the Waterloo Boy was a draft mule. It was loud, exposed to the elements, and transmitted vibration so violently that operator fatigue was a genuine hazard. Deere had spent 6 years trying to develop a tractor internally, pouring capital into prototypes like the Dane only to produce negligible volume. They realized too late that a boutique machine could not compete with Ford's assembly line or International Harvester's market saturation. They were cornered, and the Waterloo Boy was the only viable lifeline. To understand why this machine worked, you have to look at the power plant. The Waterloo Boy was driven by a horizontal 2-cylinder engine with a unique firing interval. It fired at 0 degrees, then again at 180 degrees, followed by a long passive coast of 540 degrees. This massive gap in the power stroke required a heavy flywheel to store kinetic energy and keep the crankshaft spinning during the lull. This created the distinctive syncopated rhythm that would eventually earn these engines the moniker Johnny Popper. The design wasn't just eccentric, it was a specific engineering response to fuel economics. In 1918, gasoline was a precious war commodity. Kerosene, however, was a cheap, heavy byproduct of refining that few engines could burn effectively. It had a high flash point and tended to soak spark plugs rather than vaporize. The Waterloo Boy solved this through thermal mass. The engine utilized a low compression ratio and a heavy cast iron block that retained immense heat. This heat effectively cooked the kerosene in the manifold, vaporizing it enough for ignition. It was a hot engine operationally. It smoked and it knocked, but it turned the cheapest fuel available into reliable torque when more delicate, high-compression engines failed. This brought William Butterworth to the most expensive decision of his career. He wasn't just buying a patent, he was acquiring a completely different manufacturing philosophy. The Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company was already moving volume, but the asking price was staggering, $2,350,000. In 1918, that sum represented a massive leverage of the company's future. Butterworth, a man who despised debt, was being asked to drain the reserves for a factory that built a machine his own engineering department despised. The internal conflict was palpable. Moline engineers dismissed the Waterloo Boy as crude agricultural iron. It lacked the tight tolerances, enclosed gearing, and high-tensile steel of their deceased Dane project. They argued that placing the John Deere trademark on such a crude, vibrating contraption would degrade the brand. But the dealers saw the reality of the field. They saw a tractor that maintained traction in the mud, and a machine a farmer could repair with basic hand tools. More importantly, when you looked at the spec sheet, the philosophy gap was obvious. Ford was selling a Greyhound, lightweight, high-revving, and cheap. The Waterloo Boy was a bulldog. It was a heavyweight contender at 6,100 pounds, anchored by a massive 465 cubic inch engine that chugged along at just 750 RPM. It cost significantly more, around $1,150. But that extra weight and displacement translated into something the Ford lacked: sheer, low-end torque and a cooling system that didn't boil over after an hour of hard plowing. Butterworth looked at these numbers. He saw that while Ford won on price, the Waterloo won on durability and simplicity, crucial factors for farmers transitioning from horses. He realized that technical perfection was the enemy of corporate survival. On March 14, 1918, the hesitation ended. Butterworth signed the check. John Deere acquired the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company. With one signature, the company pivoted its core identity from steel plows to kerosene horsepower. The deal was done, but the integration was hostile. Deere owned the factory, but they had inherited a cultural conflict that would define the company for the next decade. As the ink dried, the company effectively fractured. One half of the story was about to unfold on the war-torn fields of Britain, while the other was brewing on the factory floor in Iowa. The validation of this controversial purchase didn't happen in an American showroom. It happened in the mud of the Western Front supply lines. By 1918, Great Britain was effectively under siege. German U-boats had severed the critical Atlantic supply arteries, creating a hunger blockade that threatened to starve the Allied war effort into submission. Britain needed to grow its own food, and it needed to break ground immediately. Deere found themselves stepping into an operation that was already running at redline. Since 1915, an importer named L.J. Martin had been bringing Waterloo Boys into the UK and rebranding them as the Overtime. These units were painted a nondescript battleship gray, stripping away the American branding for the British market. While the executives in Moline terrified themselves thinking this crude machine would damage their premium reputation, the overtime was busy saving the country. The conditions in England were brutal, but this is exactly where the low-tech nature of the machine became its greatest asset. Gasoline, petrol, was strictly rationed for the military, making the Waterloo Boys' ability to burn cheap, unrefined kerosene, known as paraffin in the UK, a logistical lifesaver. Furthermore, with the male workforce conscripted, the fields were often worked by the Women's Land Army. These operators needed a machine that was simple and forgiving, not a complex piece of engineering that required a master mechanic to finesse. While complex British steam engines bogged down in the deep clay, the overtime kept chugging. But back in Moline, there were no celebrations. A civil war had broken out inside the factory walls. You have to remember who these engineers were. These were men who had spent their lives perfecting the curve of a self-scouring steel plow. They viewed themselves as artists of agriculture, accustomed to high-grade polished steel and micrometer precision. To them, the Waterloo Boy wasn't a savior, it was a mechanical insult. Leading the opposition was L.R. Clausen, a man who viewed the Waterloo factory not as a manufacturing plant, but as a blacksmith shop. In the hierarchy of manufacturing, this was a fighting slur. It implied that the machine was hammered together by a brute rather than designed by a mechanic. Clausen and the Moline Old Guard had a specific technical grievance: exposed gearing. The Waterloo Boys' final drive gears were open to the elements. In the sandy, dusty conditions of American farming, open gears act as a grinding paste, wearing down steel teeth rapidly. Moline demanded an immediate redesign, with enclosed, oil-bathed transmissions. They argued that selling this Iowa-built contraption was a betrayal of the legacy established by John Deere himself. This wasn't just professional jealousy, it was a clash of cultures. The Moline faction believed in engineering purity. The Waterloo faction believed in utility. They didn't care if the engine sounded like a cannon or if the gears were naked, as long as it started on a cold morning and dragged a plow for 10 hours straight. The tension threatened to fracture the management, but the numbers coming back from the overtime operation were impossible to ignore. The British farmers didn't care about the lack of refinement. They cared that the tractor cost half as much as the competition and actually finished the job. The overtime proved that in a crisis, whether a world war or a corporate pivot, reliability is the only metric that counts. Slowly, begrudgingly, the mood in Moline shifted. The engineers didn't learn to love the machine, but they started to accept the revenue. They stopped seeing it as a stain on their reputation and started seeing it as the engine that kept the lights on. The pragmatic victory was complete. The blacksmith's job had outperformed the masterpiece. With the internal strife settling into a fragile truce, the company finally had a unified front, and they would need it. While they were fighting amongst themselves, a shadow had fallen across the American market. The internal war was over, but the external war was just beginning. Henry Ford was done playing nice with pricing, and he was preparing to unleash a machine that wasn't just cheap, it was physically dangerous. By 1920, the economic friction between Henry Ford and John Deere had shifted from a skirmish to a slaughter. Ford wasn't content with market dominance. He wanted market erasure. He drove prices down relentlessly, slashing the Fordson Model F to a staggering $395 in early 1922. To put that in perspective, Ford admitted he was selling units below his own production cost, using his massive automotive profits to subsidize the losses just to starve out the competition. For Deere, selling the Waterloo Boy at that price was a mathematical impossibility. They were staring down a barrel where the only outcome looked like liquidation. But while Ford was winning the price war, he was losing the battle of physics. The two machines represented diametrically opposed engineering philosophies. The Fordson was sleek, modern, and automotive. It weighed only 2,700 pounds and introduced the revolutionary unit frame design. It was light, agile, and seemingly high-tech. In contrast, the Waterloo Boy looked like a fossil. It was built on a heavy channel iron frame, carrying that massive thumping two-cylinder engine. It weighed over 6,000 pounds. But in the erratic world of early mechanized farming, that weight wasn't a penalty, it was an anchor. The showdown moved to a new impartial arena, the Nebraska tractor test. This wasn't a sales floor, it was a scientific gauntlet mandated by law to separate marketing lies from mechanical truth. On October 9, 1920, the Waterloo Boy Model N became the very first tractor tested, test number 001. The results were vindicating. It didn't just survive, it thrived, delivering nearly 16 drawbar horsepower and 26 belt horsepower, exceeding its advertised ratings. Under that same scrutiny, the glossy image of the Fordson began to crack. Its greatest strength, its lightweight, turned out to be a lethal flaw. The Fordson utilized a high-torque worm gear final drive. If the gear wheels hit a stubborn rock, that torque had to go somewhere. Because the front end was so light, there was no counterweight to stop the physics. In a split second, the nose would hit, and the machine would flip backward, crushing the driver in the metal seat. Farmers grimly nicknamed it the Widowmaker. It was cheap, yes, but the cost of ownership often included your life. Furthermore, the tests exposed a critical reliability issue. The Fordson used a thermosiphon cooling system. It had no water pump. It relied on hot water rising naturally to circulate coolant. When subjected to the grueling stationary work of threshing, where a tractor sits still at full throttle for hours running a belt, the Fordson simply couldn't shed the heat. It boiled over constantly. This is where the Waterloo Boys' primitive design suddenly looked like genius. The machine's massive engine featured a high-capacity cooling system and that crucial hot manifold. While the delicate Fordson choked on hot kerosene and boiled its radiator, the Waterloo Boys' massive iron block acted as a giant heat sink. It didn't just tolerate the heat, it harnessed it to vaporize the fuel. The heavy frame that made it look obsolete acted as a safety ballast, keeping the nose on the ground when the plow hit a rock. The open, chugging engine that sounded so crude ran cool and steady, hour after hour. The results were undeniable. The Fordson was a sprinter that collapsed in a marathon. The Waterloo Boy was a tank. Farmers began to realize that saving money on the purchase price wasn't worth much if the machine spent half its life cooling down and the other half trying to kill you. Deere's sales teams seized on this, marketing the Waterloo Boy not as the cheapest option, but as the one that would ensure you came home for dinner. The technology had survived the ultimate test, and the company had weathered the storm. However, the executives in Moline knew they couldn't sell ugly forever. The engine had proven its soul, but the chassis was still an eyesore. To secure the next century of dominance, they needed to take this winning heart and wrap it in a body that looked like a legend. By 1923, the identity crisis was over. The company stripped the Waterloo Boy badge off the radiator and rolled out a machine that was finally proud to carry the founder's name. This was the birth of the Model D, the first tractor to exclusively bear the brand John Deere. It wasn't just a rebrand, it was a synthesis. The Model D represented the moment the two warring tribes within the company finally merged their strengths into a single piece of iron. The heart of the machine remained the rugged, horizontal two-cylinder engine from Iowa, initially 465 cubic inches, later bored out to 501. But the chassis was pure Moline. The crude exposed bull gears that had disgusted the Illinois engineers were gone. They were replaced by a compact, fully enclosed transmission case running in a constant oil bath. This brought automotive-grade precision to the filth of the farm, finally granting the wish of the Moline engineers who had despised the open gears. The result was a machine so robust it stayed in production for 30 years, until 1953, the longest production run of any tractor in the company's history. This machine also codified the visual identity that would define the brand. For the first time, the tractor left the factory in a deliberate two-tone scheme. The body was finished in a deep forest green to blend with the foliage, while the wheels were dipped in bright yellow for visibility. While this was a safety feature, it established a trade dress so powerful it would eventually become legally protected intellectual property. However, the most enduring legacy wasn't the paint, it was the acoustic signature. As competitors moved toward smooth-running 4- and 6-cylinder automotive engines, John Deere doubled down on the horizontal two-cylinder. It seemed like a refusal to modernize, but the physics were sound. It didn't drone, it popped. This created the legendary Johnny Popper rhythm. You didn't need to see the field to know who was working it. You could identify the stroke of that engine from 2 miles away. But that sound was really the sound of stored energy. That long pause in the firing order allowed the engine to rely on the massive thermal and kinetic mass of the flywheel to power through load spikes. When a lightweight multi-cylinder engine hit a tree stump or a patch of clay, it would often stall immediately. The Johnny Popper would just grunt, drop in RPMs, and let the flywheel momentum drag the plow through the obstacle. It was an engine designed for low-end torque, not horsepower, and it earned a reputation for being nearly impossible to stall. Looking back, the acquisition of the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company stands as one of the most successful corporate gambles in industrial history. William Butterworth's decision to spend $2.35 million, a sum that terrified his accountants, didn't just buy a factory, it purchased the company's soul. The ugly technology that the Moline engineers once despised became the cornerstone of the brand's dominance. The reliability of that two-cylinder engine financed the company's expansion and allowed them to survive the Great Depression while others folded. Today, if you visit Waterloo, Iowa, you will find the John Deere Waterloo Works. It remains the company's flagship facility at one of the largest tractor-producing plants in North America. The gamble paid off, not because they bought the most advanced technology, but because they bought the one thing that actually worked when the conditions got tough. That check for $2.35 million didn't just save the company from extinction, it bought them the future.